This episode is sponsored by Masterclass. Though it is really important to know stuff, Masterclass's world-famous instructors show you how to do what's important to you. When I set out to prepare for this podcast almost exactly 1 year ago, I knew in April 2020 that I needed to get better at writing. That's where one of my favorite authors, Malcolm Gladwell, came in. Masterclass makes it possible for me and others wanting to improve their writing to take a class from Malcolm Gladwell on writing at our own pace. You can watch, and in many cases listen to awesome instructors like Malcolm Gladwell teach you how to do what's important to you. You want to be a better cook? Gordon Ramsay teaches you how on the Masterclass platform. You want to learn how to act? Natalie Portman teaches you on the Masterclass platform. Grow yourself and support Forgotten Wars by trying Masterclass for the year using the link in our show notes. Learn how to do what's important to you from the experts. Now, to our episode.
This is Forgotten Wars.
The country is miserably poor, and public credit is at so low an ebb that the paper currency, which is the only money circulating in the Republic, is worth next to nothing. There are laws, but obedience to them is far from general. Little, if any, respect for authority exists. There are many high-sounding officials and departments, but there is no unity of action among them, and they are mostly maintained for show. 1 or 2 districts are in a state of open revolt against a government which is as weak and imbecile as it is notoriously cruel. Education is all but neglected. The state does not support more than 4 schools, and the teachers complain that they cannot get their salaries. End quote. English journalist and abolitionist Frederick William Chesson made this observation about where the Transvaal, the South African Republic, stood in 1868. F.W. Chesson wasn't alone in making such withering criticisms of the Transvaal. Another observer wrote, quote, "The Volksraad is incapable to make laws, the executive is too feeble to carry them out, and the people on the whole too indifferent to obey them. Nothing but confusion, disorder, and stagnation." End quote. Then something rather uncharacteristic happened.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire, but that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Act the part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
Many Transvaal Boers set aside their strict religious preferences and elected a progressive minister of the Dutch Reformed Church to be their president in 1872. Boers electing this man of a different Christian denomination than the Doppers may evoke a history lover's memory of John F. Kennedy becoming the first Catholic president of the United States over 100 years later. The British took it further in 1868. British voters put the Conservative Party in power. The Conservative Party leader at the time, Jewish MP Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli served briefly as the British's first Jewish prime minister in 1868 for just a few months. He and the Conservative Party returned to power in 1874. For 6 years. Electing a Jew as president would remain unthinkable in the Transvaal, but electing this Dutch Reform minister from the wrong denomination marked a major turning point in the Transvaal's history. Why did the previous president of the Transvaal lose public confidence? Well, you'll remember from our last episode that the previous president, Martinus Pretorius, son of the Pretorius who led many Boers to the Transvaal decades earlier, agreed to let the British arbitrate who would get the diamond mining territory between the Cape, Orange Free State, and the Transvaal. The British vindicated Paul Kreuger's fears of British arbitration when the British formed the nation of Land West in the Diamond Territory and then annexed the territory in late 1871. The Transvaal's Volksraad protested against what President Pretorius had allowed the British to do. President Pretorius resigned amidst these protests. Paul Kruger rejected calls to run for president and instead backed William Robinson. After Thomas Burgers defeated William Robinson by a wide margin, Kruger ostensibly extended his loyalty. In his autobiography, Kruger writes that he spoke the following to Burgers after Burgers took his oath of office, quote, "Your Honor, I have done my best to prevent your election, principally because of your religious views, which appear to me to be mistaken. But as you have now been elected by the majority, I submit as a good Republican to this vote of the people, trusting that you are a more earnest believer than I thought, in which case I will congratulate you with all my heart." End quote. Burgers replied, "Burger, who voted against me for conscience sake, you are as dear to me as those who voted for me." Kruger became Burgers' vice president. President Burgers got to work raising loans in Europe to help the Transvaal build more roads, build more schools, and become more solvent. President Burgers put his entire personal fortune into the national treasury. He even sought to raise money to have a railway built to the Delagoa Bay to get the Boers independent access to the sea they so desperately craved. Paul Kruger liked this idea too, but building this railroad was an idea too ahead of its time and could not garner sufficient public support. President Burgers couldn't even get his citizens to pay for a war they fought in 1876. One tribe triumphed, while Burgers' administration fell apart after this war. If you would like to help keep Forgotten Wars producing and growing, would you do at least 2 of 3 things? First, would you share a link to the podcast with someone you think might enjoy it? Second, if you're listening on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or other providers, would you make sure to like or follow our podcast? If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, would you give us a 5-star rating and write a thoughtful review there? You can even do that while you're listening. Lastly, if you want more from the show, bonus episodes, behind the mic access, transcripts and sources, and much more, and you want to support the show, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/forgottenwars. That is patreon.com/forgottenwars. The link is also in this episode's notes. Thanks to those of you who have done one of these things already. Know that you're appreciated. Now, back to our episode. The Boer people have a well-known saying to praise men who controlled their emotions. This high compliment goes something like, "The man is like a sheep, he cries inside." How can being compared to a sheep be a compliment? Because the Boer greatly admired the fact that sheep make no noise when they are slaughtered. The Boer people settled along the Steelport River just northeast of what would become the Transvaal over 100 years later. Speaking about the Boer's war tactics to the South African Military History Society, H.W. Kinsey reports the observation of British Major C.L. Harries, quote, "The custom was to send men to the tribe to be attacked, ostensibly for the purpose of doctoring or of selling beadwork, but in truth, they were spies who reported upon a favorable opportunity for the onslaught on the kraal. The chief would then summon all the men of his following to assemble with their weapons, which consisted chiefly of assahais and battle axes. The men were aware of the need to bring food supplies. It did not take long to assemble, and the whole of the Boer army would set off in the opposite direction to their destination, which was kept secret from the main following until the second night, when suddenly the course would be changed, and all haste made to the kraal to be attacked. The attack was made stealthily, and no prisoners were taken, except the women and children. In most cases, the attacks were effectual, and a great deal of bloodshed resulted. Unlike the Zulus and Matabele, to whom the art of war and military strategy was a science, and military discipline was a way of life, the military organization of the Boer was very crude. Each man provided for himself and followed his own ideas as to what he should do. Tactics were formulated by the chief in council, and the execution of the tactics was assigned to the chief's own brother, who exercised active command of the tribesmen. All the cattle looted were handed to the man in command, who caused a third to be slaughtered, a third to be sent to the chief's kraal, and the remaining third to be handed back to the party who had looted them. Women and children were regarded as loot and divided among the followers of the chief. The Boer trekkers began to bicker with the Bapedi beginning in the mid-1840s. The Boers encroached on Bapedi land. The Bapedi would raid Boer livestock. Hendrik Pootgieter attacked the Bapedi in 1847 and then again in September of 1852 with a commando of 320 Boers. The water supply to the Bapedi village of Simmering was cut off. Some young girls carrying pots and a bold young warrior, Sekhukhune, slipped through Boer siege lines. They filled the pots with water. The girls and Sekhukhune crept back through the siege lines and relieved the village's defenders. The Boer commando was driven back. The Bapedi king at the time moved from Simmering to the eastern slope of the Lulu Mountains and established a heavily fortified village, Jate. Conflict still remained between Boer and Bapedi. The Boers kidnapping Bapedi children to be indentured slaves on their farms, the Bapedi continuing to raid Boer livestock. The Boers and Bapedi made temporary peace on November 17, 1857. The Steelport River became the border between the Boer and Bapedi. By 1861, the Bapedi numbered between 60,000 and 70,000. Their army stood 12,000 strong, with a third of them carrying guns. The brave warrior who slipped through Boer siege lines nearly a decade before succeeded his father as king in 1861. But not before murdering all of his rival for the throne's advisors. Mampuru, Sekhukhune's half-brother, was that rival. Mampuru fled the kingdom. Sekhukhune assumed the throne at age 47. He was cruel. His people didn't like him. He smuggled muskets and ammunition from farmers who purchased these arms at the Delagoa Bay. Sekhukhune's army withstood another invasion in 1875, this time by the Swazi. Sekhukhune's confidence grew. When Boer miners tried to prospect for gold in Bapedi territory, the Bapedi refused. When a total lie reached President Thomas Burger's ear in early 1876, it was the beginning of the end, his presidency's end. From what I gather from my sources, a Boer farmer by the name of Jacobitz reportedly trespassed onto the land of another brother of Sekhukhune's, Johannes Dingwanyane. Jacobitz felled some trees in this Bapedi territory and carried the wood back to his nearby farm in Boer territory. Then some Bapedi raided the Jacobitz farm by throwing the newly collected wood off of Jacobitz's wagon and taking down the beacons on Jacobitz's property on March 13, 1876. Then the Boers spread a lie that Johannes himself had burned down a German mission station near the Boer-Bapedi border. When President Burgers heard of this fictitious burning, he flew into a rage and vowed to handle the Sekhukhune problem himself. The Transvaal Volksraad declared war on Sekhukhune on May 16, 1876. The former Dutch Reformed Church minister assembled the largest army the Transvaal had ever seen, 2,000 Boers along with several hundred Swazis and some other natives hoping to take Bapedi land as spoil. Some oral histories even claim that Sekhukhune's rival to the throne, Mampuru, persuaded the Swazis to join the Boer attack on his former Bapedi tribe. Paul Kruger was too ill to fight alongside this joint force of Boers and Swazis, which, given what we already know about Kruger, must mean he was very ill. These forces were split between two commandants, Martinus Pretorius and Nicolaas Smut. Commandant Smut's forces kicked off the war by being repulsed by the Bapedi at Matabele's Kop until President Burgers arrived. Then Smut's forces successfully stormed the Kop on July 5th, 1876, losing only 3 Boers and 5 native allies in the process. 3 days later, Commandant General Pretorius's eastern forces attacked Magnet Heights on July 8, 1876. It was a slaughter. Pretorius's forces killed about 400 Bapedi while losing 1 Boer and 8 native allies. It appeared the Bapedi would be crushed. The eastern force, this time led by Commandant Quitsia, sought to destroy Johannes's village on July 13th. The plan was for the Boers to begin the attack, with the Swazi force to join them in a surprise attack on the village. But the Boers didn't attack. The Swazis still followed through on their surprise attack. They took the village and mortally wounded Johannes, the half-brother of Sekhukhune. When the Boers demanded that they share in the spoil, the cattle of the village, The Swazi, the ones who had done the fighting and dying, refused in disgust. This disgust over the Boers leaving them to take the village alone likely was why the Swazis parted ways with Kwitsia's eastern Boer forces, although rumors of an impending attack on the Swazi homeland also could have driven them to part ways. Boer forces, on the other hand, linked up and made for Sekhukhune's village. During the darkness of July 31st, the Boers had a plan. Attack the village with 800 Boers and 500 native allies from the south, while another smut-led force of 900 Boers and a company of natives attacked from the north. All this while the village was bombarded with 4 Krupp cannons. The attack did not go according to plan. Bapedi drove back the southern force. That southern force did not or could not tell about their failure in time to the attacking northern force. Smut's northern force reached the village, set fire to some huts, but had to retreat because they couldn't overcome the Bapedi there without the southern force's support. The Boers retreated across the Steelport River and returned to their homes. The Transvaal Executive Council tried but failed to find the Boers who had refused to go through with the attack on Sekhukhune's village. President Burgers then hired Prussian mercenaries and had forts fortified along the Steelport River to protect against Bapedi counterattacks. Sekhukhune did manage to raid, or in his view, reclaim cattle along his protected border, but he did not overcome the Boer border patrols. The Boers continued to launch enough lightning attacks on the Bapedi, enough to sow the seeds of famine, to prevent the Bapedi from planting their crops. This fear of famine brought Sekhukhune to the negotiating table at Potsabelo Mission Station. Sekhukhune signed a treaty in February of 1877, agreeing to pay a fine of 2,000 head of cattle, and possibly agreeing that he was now a subject of the Transvaal. Whether Sekhukhune actually submitted to subject status would remain to be seen. The First Sekhukhune War helped break Transvaal independence. President Burgers could not get his Volksraad to agree to necessary tax increases to pay for their Steelport fortifications. His Vice President Kruger would not support this tax. Kruger's biographer Prescott Holmes wrote the following about the no-win situation Burgers faced. Quote, Kruger and his allies grumbled while the country was going to ruin, without putting out a hand to save it. The country was threatened by the Zulus, but for the time the Boers seemed to have even lost their love of fighting, for they would not loyally respond to the president's call to fight the natives. The farmers refused to pay taxes, and the government could not compel them. All the loans were swallowed up, Burgers' private fortune had disappeared, and it was impossible to borrow more even on the personal security of the executive. End quote. Remember that Burgers earlier had donated his whole fortune to the Transvaal. That donation had run dry. Prescott continues, quote, As if this were not enough, Cetshwayo, the Zulu king, was threatening to overwhelm the land with his impice. It seemed plain that if in a few weeks something was not done, the Transvaal Republic would be swept out of existence by the blacks. End quote. This dynamic of a disloyal opposition criticizing the incumbent executive's leadership, but then obstructing nearly all solutions the executive pursues, is nothing new in our world's democratic history. This knowledge was no consolation for President Burgers. Vice President Kruger records in his autobiography that President Burgers raged against the Volksraad in 1877 for the refusal to approve taxes the nation arguably needed for its own survival. Kruger recounts the following one-on-one conversation with Burgers immediately after Burgers' angry speech. President Burgers reportedly slapped Kruger on the back and said, Mr. Kruger, you can't deny that the Burgers who refuse to pay taxes are in a state of rebellion against their government. Kruger answered, I deny it absolutely, on the grounds which I have already stated. They don't refuse to pay their taxes, but they do refuse to pay a tax which you have added, without authority, to the already existing taxes. But even if the facts were as you say, I should like to ask you a question. Would you consider it a proof of affection to accuse your wife, no matter what her faults, openly before her bitterest enemy? That is what you have done to the Republic in the presence of her enemy, and this is to me a proof that you do not love but hate the Republic. End quote. The president was silent and left. Whether or not you think Kruger was unfair in questioning Burgers' love of country, I do think he was unfair, for the record. What you should know is that Burgers blasted the uncooperative Volksraad, when British Special Commissioner Sir Theophilus Shepstone was present. That is the wife's bitterest enemy that Kruger was alluding to. Sir Theophilus Shepstone arrived in the Transvaal in January of 1877 with secret instructions from the British Colonial Secretary, the Earl of Carnarvon. The secret instructions: look for the right opportunity to annex the Transvaal, with or without popular consent, even though this would be a blatant violation of the Sand River Convention. In his History of the Transvaal Rebellion, or the First Boer War if you like, John Laband tells us the English Transvaalers were united behind Sir Shepstone, while the Boers split into a President Burgers faction and a Vice President Kruger faction. Laband writes, quote, "The Burgers were unwilling to pay the emergency taxes levied by the Volksraad. The public debt was 192,399, and concern about the threat apparently posed by a resurgent Zulu kingdom in alliance with the Pedi was much played up by Shepstone. Thus, when Shepstone proclaimed the Transvaal a British colony and ran up the Union flag in Church Square in Pretoria, opposition was muted. The Volksraad resolved to send a delegation abroad to make objections to annexation widely known, and meanwhile appealed to citizens to refrain from violence so as not to prejudice their mission." End quote. When the Union Jack was raised in the Transvaal capital of Pretoria on April 12, 1877, the Confederation of South Africa that the British so badly wanted looked so very possible. The Earl of Carnarvon, the British Colonial Secretary, Uniter of Canada, had sent one of the British Empire's best administrators. The current administrator in India, Sir Bartley Frere, left for Cape Town with orders to make this South African Confederation a reality. Laband continues, quote, "When Frere arrived in South Africa in March 1877, Shepstone was on the verge of consummating the annexation of the Transvaal, thus securing the northern component of Confederation and putting pressure on the isolated Orange Free State."